started. Good morning, and thank you all for joining. I'd like to welcome everybody to our 7th Watershed Wednesday. I'm Emily Decar. I'm the Ag Coordinator for the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. Just as a little bit of background, I guess, Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association. We put these weekly sessions together to take the place of the Upper Susquehanna Watershed Forum that we usually hold every fall. So this is in the place of the one that we were going to hold for 2020 since we're unable to meet in person this year. We have one more session right now scheduled for the month of August. The info on that session will be posted at the end of today's presentation. But make sure you keep an eye on our website and our Facebook page for announcements for future sessions. We're still working on deciding if we're going to have them in September or if we're going to take a little bit of time off so that kids can go back to school and not have extra going on. So we'll make sure we get that announcement out as soon as we can. During today's presentation, like Amy had mentioned, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box and we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So to get things started, our presenter today is David Orr. David is the Director and Senior Engineer for the Cornell Local Roads Program, the New York State Local Technical Assistance Program Center. David has over 30 years experience with the local highway communities and is a New York State licensed professional engineer and has a PhD on local roads from Cornell University. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to David.
Oh, good morning and welcome. So let's see, we get about 13 of us on the call, including myself. So we also might be using the chat pod and the raise hand feature. So hopefully you know where everything is for that as we go through and ask some questions. So I'm going to be talking about two things. One is a survey that was done with myself and Dr. Rebecca Schneider on how people maintain ditches here in New York. And then also talk a little bit about a project we did with the county we're located in here in Ithaca, Tompkins County, and some replumbing ideas that we were trying out. And we're still looking for some additional sites to move that particular idea forward. So we'll start with the purpose of ditches. So obviously, here's a road in pretty bad shape, but just so everybody's on the same page, it helps me out. In the chat pod, what do you think is the purpose of a ditch? You could put in what you think the purpose of a ditch is in the chat pod. Give me a couple of answers. Also, make sure you have to find the chat pod. To remove water from the roadway is one answer. Yeah, keep water off the road. Yeah. Let me get one more here. Convey water to an outlet. Store water and debris, and that's actually an interesting one. You can possibly slow water down. One of the things that Dr. Schneider found in some work she's been doing over the years is that ditches actually convey pollution, silts, lots of things faster, increase pollution if they're not designed carefully. And so it's a balancing act. They have a purpose, ditches do. They protect the roadway. If you think about a pavement as a schematic, a ditch can actually keep the water from getting into the roadway in certain situations. And the concept is to move that water away so the pavement stays dry, it stays stronger, and that's one of its primary purposes. But a ditch can also move water quickly and convey it, not necessarily in the way we want it to be maintained. So I'll start here with a fairly shallow ditch. This ditch, even down at that small little culvert, the driveway, you can see down there the entrance to the cemetery. It's only about 8-9 inches deep. The pipe's actually about half filled. You think that ditch is deep enough to protect the roadway? Yes or no? You can either, yes, ditch, yep. It might be, and it might not be. It depends. It depends on what its purpose is. If it's only carrying surface water and the water that comes from the roadway itself, that's all you need. It's just a swale at that particular point. Now, if you've got a water issue, you could actually have solved that problem by coming in here. We do this quite often on roads, and we put a subsurface drain, backfill it properly, and that keeps the water from getting to the roadway. And in that case, the ditch only needs to move surface water. It doesn't need to be very deep at all. You're draining the base with a subsurface drain, and then you just have to be wary how the water comes out of the subsurface drain. versus here's a road that I built when I worked over in Yates County, New York, near Pinyan. If you've ever looked at a map of the Finger Lakes, there's one that looks like a Y. That's where Yates County is. Here's a ditch. It goes into the subgrade, the native material, okay? And then it comes up about a foot of gravel, and then we're going to be paving it eventually with about another 6 inches of asphalt. So its total depth, time we're said and done, is going to be 24 inches. Okay, with a nice flat slope, so it's relatively safe. Is that ditch deep enough? 24 inches? Yes or no? It depends. It always depends a little bit, but generally, yes. Most of the time, very few ditches need to be deeper than that. All you need, if you're draining the base of the roadway, is in this case, you don't need an under drain. You're draining the base directly to the ditch. All you need to do is get into the subgrade a few inches. There's no need to go deeper than that in almost any case. And the few times where it is, the people doing the work, the highway departments, should have probably brought in the conservation districts or the soil and water districts. They bring somebody in to help make sure that ditch is properly sized, not too big, not too small. Most ditches are probably too deep. One of the challenges we've got, though, is the ditch needs to be clear and maintained. And so when we talk about ditching, cleaning a ditch, this is what I talk about when I clean a ditch, okay? Most people tend to want to scrape the thing too much. To me, cleaning a ditch is removing only the material that is needed to reestablish the flow. Probably should be laid out ahead of time. That's what we actually did in this particular case. We actually shot the grade ahead of time with a level. And we used a hand level actually to check everything as we were going along. We didn't stake it. We could have. Depends on, again, how good your operator is and other factors. But the point is, don't remove any more than you absolutely have to. And try to, at all costs, avoid touching the fore and the back slope. Don't touch them. There's really no need to do so in most cases. And again, if you need help, you can always go get it. But that's a habit it's hard to get out of because you got this big machine and it can scrape. And so people tend to do this way too often. And that's not a really fun thing to do. Now, we have a class we teach here in New York at the Local Roads program on drainage. And so part of the class, we did some calculations, and I got a little number for you. You've all probably know about the universal soil loss equation. If you calculate the universal soil loss equation for the typical kind of glacial tills you see in most of New York State, 1 acre of land and 1 mile of ditch, by the way, have a very similar surface area. Okay, obviously it varies depending on the width and the depth of the ditch, but they're actually pretty darn close. So you can calculate out what 1 acre of land has eroded before you can detect the erosion, before the rills start to form, or 1 mile of ditch. How much material do you think is washed away in 1 mile of ditch before you and I can detect it with our eye? And just gives a reminder, that's about the thickness somewhere between a dime and a nickel, maybe about the thickness of a penny. What do you think that is in terms of tons? 1 acre of land exposed, not protected, starts to erode. How much erodes before you and I can, with our eye, detect it? 10 to 12 tons. Okay. Any other guesses? And that's a pretty good one. It turns out you can do the math, and I've updated it with the updated universal soil loss equation. And it turns out the answer is actually about, it's not going to show up real well there, I'll put it over here, 30 tons. That's before you and I can detect it in 1 mile of ditch or 1 acre of land, before the rills start to get deep enough to really see, hey, there's erosion going on. So by the time you see this level of deterioration and erosion, you've actually got a lot more than 30 tons per mile. And of course, where is all of that erosion going to settle? It's going to settle out in our streams, our ponds, in the culverts themselves. It's going to be really where we don't want it to be, okay? And by the way, the time between this photograph and this photograph was only about 2.5, 3 weeks. Pretty bad. What do you think the highway agency did in this particular case with that particular ditch? Do you think they just left it? What do you think they did? They scooped it again? Yeah, well, they might have had to. They need to do something. One of the challenges to deal with is the right-of-way. They tend to not want to go outside the right-of-way, and the edge of the right-of-way was up here. What they actually did was they brought in a bunch of pipe, and they piped it all in because it was really too deep. It was actually dangerous. And they piped it all in. Of course, that cost a lot of money. And that tree, by the way, survived. It's still there. I've walked by it in my morning walks during the COVID period. It survived. Life is pretty tenuous. I mean, not tenuous, pretty survivable. Does pretty well. But that's a lot of money, cost a lot. They should have really not touched it that deep in the first place. What's interesting is if you can get good practices in place, your ditching rates go way up. You look like a hero to the legislative people because you can now do thousands of feet a day rather than a few hundred. But that's a challenge. So one of the things we wanted to know was how are people actually maintaining their ditches? So Dr. Snyder here at Cornell at the Department of Natural Resources and a graduate student of hers named Anthony Johnson went out and surveyed with little assistance from us the entire state of New York, all of the towns and the counties, which turns out to be just about 1,000 individuals. And about a little over half replied back. I can get the exact numbers if you really care. And so I helped them with some of the analysis and some of the statistics. And as you can see, we've got a pretty good range. We heard from every single county, at least one town or the county throughout the state, with the exception of Suffolk County, which is its own unique animal anyway, with the sandbars down there. And we got a sense of what people were doing for the various operations. And as part of that, what we found was, were people scraping? Were they reseeding? Were they shaping? What were they doing? We're trying to avoid this. This is insane. There's very little reason to ever do this. That ditch was plenty deep. It was doing the job. But again, you got a backhoe, you want to dig. So what we found was, we're looking at the numbers, about half the people tend to scrape quite a bit. They scrape the bottom, they scrape they reshape the whole thing. It's, quite a bit of that. Very few's primary technique is just to mow and try to touch as little as possible, okay? About a third. And so that wasn't good. That's a lot of exposure, ditches. And then in addition, we said, well, okay, if you do scrape all that, at least maybe you vegetated or protected. So we also asked, what do you do in the way of reseeding? So we asked this question, and we actually broke the data down between the county agencies and the town agencies. And what you're really looking at is you want to avoid the blue and the red wedges. The blue means they never reseed at all. They let Mother Nature do the reseeding. And the red means they seed maybe up to a quarter of the ditches. The rest of them, they let Mother Nature take care of. What we really want to see, of course, obviously, is that light blue wedge, which is actually pretty small in both cases, where they always reseed, they always protect. But I'll be okay if they would do most of them, which is the orange wedge. Counties tend to seed a little bit more, protect a little bit more. A lot of them own hydroseeders or work with the local soil and water conservation district. Most counties have access to this, so they tend to do it quite a bit. But still, if you look at that, over half the towns that replied don't reseed at all. And so we calculated that out, and we figured out that about 1/4 of all the ditches in the state get exposed every single year to erosion. And without any protection, that means they're losing a lot of material every single year. Even if you just assume that 30 tons per mile, there's 115,000 miles of roads in New York State. And let's say half of them have ditches. At least that's what the numbers we came up with. That's a lot of material. And so we're like, okay, can we improve practices? Can we start to educate? And we've been doing a lot of that. We've actually got a project this summer with a couple of students who had summer internships. Their summer internships disappeared, And so they needed something. So, hey, we have a win-win situation. We have a project for them. And they started doing some ditch mapping. We came up with a simple assessment sheet to say, okay, how do we calculate how is the ditch doing? So we looked at the problems, the issues you deal with, such as depth and width, and is it vegetated or not? Are the banks vegetated? What's the adjacent land use? So we could start to do some analysis of this, and they're still working on that project. Should be just about done. I don't know exactly where it stands. I need to follow up on that. But we wanted to keep it simple. We thought it was more important to get good data quickly than trying to get so much detail that you lose yourself in the numbers. But those information should be available pretty soon. Part of the reason we did all of this, and part of the reason we were trying to do some of this, is are there better ways to replumb? We've done some analysis on this, and maybe we could replumb, keep the ditches doing their job of draining the roadway or draining the roadside without losing the value that a ditch could provide if it's done right to hold and store the water, as somebody had mentioned earlier. So we had what we thought was a new choice out there. So we had a project not too far outside of Ithaca in County Road up here, in the town of Ulysses. And there's a farm. You can see the picture from above, and there's some different tiles that come out of the field. And you can imagine there's water flowing. Now, the picture on the top right is the ditch with the green arrow. It's pretty shallow. It's not too bad. It's safe in terms of if a vehicle goes off, it's not going to create a major safety issue. So that's not too bad. But when you get to that stretch over here, that I'm circling now, it gets pretty deep. Now, it doesn't look like it where that mailbox is in the lower left corner, but that ditch right there is actually almost 8 feet deep at the outlet end, okay? If I'm standing in the ditch, and we surveyed it, I'm standing in the ditch, the top of my head, I can't see the shoulder of the road. So it's pretty darn deep, and you really wouldn't want to go off that with a car. And so it's unsafe, and it's actually transporting a lot of fluid very quickly from the field. And the farmer has field tiles, and those field tiles are putting out a lot of water, okay? So there was a lot of good things going on. You can see there's quite a bit of erosion. So could we slow that water down while still keeping the ditch deep enough and protecting the roadway? And so what we said was, yeah, I think we can. We can replumb that, okay? Now, we want to make sure we don't create a flooding issue. There's a lot of water that you're dealing with, and we want to be careful of capillarity with bringing the water back up into the roadway. But what we said is, instead of putting a subsurface drain parallel to the roadway ditch, which is the common practice when you refill them back in, why don't we put in a series of flat subsurface drains? So what you're looking here is a quick schematic. We just drafted something up real fast. And each of the black lines is a subsurface drain, okay? So we have a subsurface drain, and we just lay them out so that they're flat. They actually hold water. They're almost like a detention basin built into the ditch. We put in a check dam at each end made out of riprap, and essentially tried to slow the water down. But by using sand, we could do some capillary breaking and keep that ditch, keep the water where it belongs, and hopefully shallow it up quite a bit. So this is during the operations. They scraped all the vegetation away. They put in the check dams. They backfilled it all with sand, okay? And you can see in the lower right, there's the subsurface drains. We didn't use any fabrics, just sand. Sand is actually a pretty darn good filter. Works pretty darn well, doesn't go into the pipes. And then the people with the county actually came up with some ideas to protect the sand until they could get vegetation. So they just layered it with a thin layer of stone. Okay, so you can see what it looks like. The upstream end did hold a little bit of water, more than we'd like during high water periods. We've thought about some changes for future designs. And if you were on real early, you heard me talking with Angel Heinekel here with Arsenal and the Water Conservation District, trying to find another site or two. But they protected it until they could get back in there. It's still a little bit deeper than I'd like, but they put in finally the lift of topsoil, they vegetated it, and it's actually in pretty good shape now. So at the deep end, it's still, as I say, it's deeper than I'd like. It's about 4 feet now. I'd really like to get it down to closer to that 2 to 2.5 feet that we saw in the earlier picture. But the nice thing about this is, at least if a vehicle goes off on this particular stretch of road now, it's not going to flip. Okay, so it's going to just stay down into the ditch. They'll walk away. So it's an improvement in safety. It seems to be holding the water back. It's obviously holding the water back enough for cattails to actually grow. And we think it's an alternative. As people are doing their ditches, they can make them shallower, safer, and at the same time, hopefully, we keep that water on site and protect the environment. So we get a win-win out of it. We didn't get to our ditches like they are now in a couple of years. We got them into a couple of decades. It's going to take time to come back out of this, but we think this is a way to do this. And in addition, some of the work that Dr. Schneider's been working on are biosocks and biofilters that you could actually put in the ditch. They can actually pull some of the phosphorus and other chemicals out. And you can actually put that into an operation like this very, very easily. And so that's what we're looking at for future activities. And with that, just to have a little bit of fun, we do a cartoon strip here with our quarterly newsletter. We actually did one on ditches. So we put one out. We call them the pothole potentate to give people information on what they should be doing on ditches with best management practices. And that's what we're really trying to do, is get people to use best management practice. So with that, any questions, any thoughts, anything I can help you with? What do you think? And do you have a site maybe we could try out?
Feel free to put your questions in the chat box. And we're not a huge group, so if we can do it in an orderly manner, if you feel like you want to unmute yourself and say hello, feel free.
They haven't had their coffee yet. What are the top 3 BMPs that reduce erosion in ditches? By far the best 3, that's actually pretty easy. First off, reduce the amount of scraping. My rule of thumb for erosion is very simple. If it's not eroding now, leave it alone. So don't scrape any more than you absolutely have to make the ditch do its job. Number 2, revegetate, or if you need more than vegetation, structural fix, do that as quickly as possible. Okay, absolutely. And as much as possible, don't go any deeper. Not only is deeper going to reduce the erosion or create more erosion, deeper is going to make it less safe. So those are the big 3 things. If you have to, go wider. That's hard to do because of right-of-way, but that would be the 3rd one. What are the primary barriers for towns to do ditch BMPs? Part of it is habits, we think, based on the survey. Again, we've gotten in the habit of cleaning them out because we want that ditch to do its job. And there's, if a ditch is certain depth does a good job, a deeper ditch or a wider ditch, well, that'll be even better, right? It doesn't actually work that way, but that's what your brain thinks. And then you give yourself a big machine, and it's even easier to scrape and make it deeper. So it's just a habit. So I think it's a barrier in terms of just changing the standard operating practice. I think we could get people to use good standard operating practices. They'd be in good shape. A lot of agencies have done that. They actually work with their soil and water people, for instance, and they spray hydroseeding down almost immediately. That kind of thing can be very helpful. And I think that's the focus that we try to take, is get people to change their habits as much as anything. And I know that I see Mr. Blauser on there with the dirt and gravel roads folks in PA, and they do similar kinds of things. They do it with some projects, get people to learn, have some champions, and hopefully over time we get people to use better practices. Any other questions? They're gonna let me off the hook. That's pretty good. And I am looking for at least one more, maybe a couple more sites to try out this replumbing and shallowing up of the ditches. I'd like to find a few spots. If you're wondering what I'm looking for a ditch which is probably a little bit too deep, tends to be carrying a lot of water, maybe from farmers' field tiles or just a large surface area, but doesn't tend to flood over the road much. It just carries a lot of water, and maybe we can reduce the pollutants and kill 2 birds. So I'm looking for a couple more to try out, and some agencies, of course, that would be willing to try something else. They're not very expensive. You can do it as part of your other operations. Okay. Emily, Steve, Angel, anybody?
Well, if
Oh, here we go.
anyone-
Here we
okay,
go.
here you
Are
go.
ditch BMPs being recorded by New York State DEC? I don't know if they're being recorded or monitored by them. I know the State Department of Transportation has a group trying to improve ditch practices. We've met with them, and again, trying to change habits. But DEC, I think more of DEC is there's a law. You all know about phase 2. There's that 1 acre rule. If you're overexposed, technically ditches fall into that. The problem for DEC is the same problem most government agencies have. There's just not enough staff to really get out there. And most of the staff that I know really want to try to get people to do the right thing and not use enforcement as a club, but as a last resort. But it's just a staff issue for them, and go from there. And then, yeah, Angel and I are going to try to find a couple more spots. We've got one we think close by that we could try. And the goal there is to really try to improve the quality of ditches long term, because ditches have a value. They really help roadways, but at the same time, they don't need to be super deep. And if you need that much water, there are plenty of folks out there, including most of you, who could help them out and make them do the job and protect the road at the same time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, David. I have posted on the screen, next week is our last Watershed Wednesday, and I'll actually turn it over to Emily to just say a little bit about it. And yes, thank you again. And if anyone does have a question that comes up after the Watershed Wednesday is over, feel free to reach out directly to David.
Thank you, everybody. Just kind of echoing Amy, I guess. So next Wednesday, we are going to have Cortland Soil and Water. They're going to be doing a presentation on prioritizing stream culvert projects through multiple data sources. So that kind of goes back to the I-4 watershed project that we had done through the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. So they're going to talk about how they prioritize stuff after doing that I-4 watershed project. So I guess be sure to call in next week. And if there are any other questions, I believe David had his email address posted, but the presentation is also being recorded. It will be up on the website, on the USC's website, as well as Otsego County Conservation Associations. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And David, our total was 20. That included
Total was
you.
20. Okay, cool. And I did see one last question. Have benefits to reduce localized flooding been documented? That's actually one of the challenges. When we did this project, we weren't able to get up there and do some pre and post testing. So it appears to have slowed the water down by quite a bit, just empirically, but we don't have actual measurements. That's what we want to do on the second project. We did a pilot, and now with next pilot, we need to come in there and do some pre and post measurements, both of the volume and of the pollutants. And that's our goal. So. Okay. Well, thanks again for having me. That next week, actually, I know about the NAC. We're actually trying to do some analysis there. Maybe I'll step in myself if I don't have a conflict.
Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you next week then.
Well, possibly. I may have another webinar. I can't remember. It's in the calendar. Once it's in the calendar, that's all I can remember.
Completely understand. Well, thank you again, David. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks. Bye, Angel.
Bye.
Talk to you soon.